Thank you for the invitation to come to Vilnius, where I've only been once before, and it must have been 20 years ago when I was teaching on a PhD course. It was a Nordic-Baltic project in anthropology and related subjects. At the time, when we left home, we didn't expect to have access to the internet when we went abroad. And I didn't have a mobile phone. I was slow in getting a mobile phone. So if anybody wanted to reach me, if my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, wanted to reach me, she had to leave a message in the hotel. And she could also check on me whether I was in the hotel at night, you see, because if she phoned late and I wasn't in, she knew that I was out drinking beer. Whereas nowadays, the first question typically asked when you ring someone up is, "Where are you?" You know, and I even had people phoning me on my landline at home, you know, my fixed phone at home, asking me, "Where are you?" And I had to respond, "You bloody fool, you're phoning me on a landline." I mean, it's fixed, you see, it's fixed to a place. So this just as a very short vignette, I mean, to introduce my theme, which is far more general than that of the previous speaker, which had a great lecture, but very specific, on archives and the issues raised by the transition, you might say, from material to virtual ways of storing information, but also implicitly and to some extent explicitly about the exponential growth in the amount of material that needs to be stored and to be sorted and to be dealt with in one way or another. My topic, it somehow connects to the previous one, but has a much more general tenor. Doesn't really relate to my previous research. I mean, I've been doing research, as you said in your introduction, on identity politics, nationalism, globalization, and that sort of thing. This interest has been more of a side project until quite recently. And I'm now, in fact, directing a fairly large research project called Overheating. Overheating is not just about climate change. It's about what happens when you rub your hands really fast together, They heat up. It's about accelerated change and friction. Accelerated change, fast change, because there is something that has happened to globalization, and I'm returning to that in the last part of this lecture. Something has happened to globalization. It was fast to begin with. Modernity is fast. People were worrying about speed already in the 1820s when the first trains came. They were worrying about speed. They said, "Oh, yeah, this is psychologically harmful for people to travel this fast." And those trains, you know, the Great Western Railway from London to Bristol, I mean, it had an average speed of about 32 kilometers an hour. But it was still deemed fast because it was faster than the horse carriage. So yes, speed has been a concern. Speed, acceleration, and what it does to us has been a concern in modernity since the beginning. But it's sped up. It's become faster. The speed, the acceleration has accelerated. It is as if modernity has set in an extra gear around the last turn of the century. And this has happened so fast that we are only beginning to try to rebuild the ship at sea intellectually, trying to deal with what is happening around us right now. There is research on Facebook, on Twitter. There is research on all of these new ways of communicating, relating to each other. There's a nice research project at University College in London, directed by a colleague of mine, Danny Miller, on the usage of mobile phones around the world. But we're only just beginning. And as soon as the book leaves the printing press, it is already obsolete. You see, because you have to update, you have to change things, you have to add things. So my interest in this, in information technology and time, which is the topic of this lecture, it goes back to the 1990s. And I'm sorry, I have to apologize for this. This is going to be slightly autobiographical, because I discovered in my own life that something was going wrong, something was going awry. I couldn't sit down with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in the same way as I had in the 1980s, or with any other book. Because of all the disruptions, all the interruptions, that you had to do so many things at the same time. We had got email, so you were interrupted continuously with all these little snippets coming from all over the place that you had to respond to. And we had, multi-channel TV had taken on in a big way. And not just multi-channel TV, but multi-channel TV with a remote control. So that, zapping, became the order of the day. The World Wide Web had come into the world only a couple of years earlier, I mean, in 1993. So the World Wide Web is actually, for people my age, is fairly recent, We still remember the time before the World Wide Web, when getting information from the archives, from the library, implied that you had to actually go physically down to the library, either talk to a librarian or take a course on how to search information, how to find journals, and how to find the particular article that you were looking for. So things had taken off in a way, and my feeling was that this did something with our ability to concentrate and with our ability to think a thought that was longer than 10 centimeters, okay? And to relate to a time horizon which was more than 10 seconds ahead. It had done something to that. So I sat down and wrote a book. I mean, I wrote it during a summer holiday, okay, when time was a bit slower, you know, during summer holidays, okay? Time is slower. And in 2000, we still had the option of not being online during holidays. And it was considered okay. It was not considered an affront, an insult to the surrounding world not to respond to an email within 24 hours when you were on holiday. Again, this has changed, okay? People ask me now, well, you're going on holiday. Yeah, I'm leaving with my family to our summer house down the coast in July. Well, but I'm sure you'll be online. And I say, now I do. Yes, I'll be online, you know. But at the time we didn't. So I could actually write that book in the summer because we had that option of concentrating on something, which came out a half year later and was called Tyranny of the Moment, Fast and Slow Time in the Information Age. And one of the things that I'm talking about in that book, it's just a short paragraph, is the acceleration of speech. Right? You notice that I talk fast, okay? And everything accelerates in the age of information. But it's not just me. You talk fast as well. And we have research to show this, that in fact the speed of speech has accelerated by a factor of at least 50% since 1950. And I could, if anybody's interested, I mean, send me an email, okay, and I'll direct you to the relevant sources. So speech has also accelerated. But everything had accelerated. So by the time that book was published in 1991, okay, and it became for me an unexpected success. I mean, it became a major bestseller in Norway. I translated it myself into English, and it was subsequently put out in more than 30 languages, and it still comes out in new editions. Of course, I had to write a new preface and increasingly a new introduction, because it's the book is, you know, it's 14 years old, 13 years old, okay, and so much has happened in the world in those 13 years. But it became an unexpected success. I'd expected it perhaps to appeal to certain kinds of students, certain people who were interested in information technology, and maybe some people in advertising or in journalism who felt this acceleration in their everyday life. But it turned out that lots of people felt that acceleration was affecting their ability to live their lives the way they wanted to. For example, I got letters, handwritten letters, because I put that sort of thing in the book. I'd like to get your responses. Dear readers, I'd like to have your response, okay, to what I've been saying about fast and slow time, and how the fast time is somehow swallowing up the slow time, so that slowness becomes a scarce resource, okay? And so I got handwritten letters. Some of them were from people working in the health sector. And one of them from a remote part of Norway, a part of Norway which is full of elks and forest, and which is considered by the rest of us as a fairly slow place. You know, we have stereotypical jokes, okay, about people from that part of the country as being extremely slow-witted. And you ask them a question, and they respond after about 10 minutes, and the answer takes about a quarter of an hour. You know, that sort of jokes. But still, I mean, from that part of the country, I got a letter from a woman who was working in the health sector as a nurse, and she says that, you know, nowadays, I no longer have the time to do my job properly, because the kind of job you provide as a nurse is slow time with the patients, basically. It's spending time with the patients. That's what you're meant to do. But now we have to take courses, and we have to write reports, and there are so many meetings, and there's so much information processing, and so on and so forth. And I got another letter from someone who worked also in the health sector, but higher up in administration management. And he said that we just got a report about the use of time, as it were, the time budgets in the health sector, which is chronically underfunded, of course, in every country. I mean, even in the world's richest country, which is Norway, okay? It's underfunded chronically and chronically inefficient. You know, and nobody knows why. And he said that this report reveals that we spend about 45% of our budgets on information processing in one way or another. And everybody agrees that the figure should have been somewhere between 3 and 4%. But nobody knows how to get there. You know, so you have surgeons who spend 7% of their working time actually operating on patients. 7%. And the rest of the time is spent on various forms of, well, information processing and other things. So in other words, this analysis about acceleration and speed had an unexpected appeal. I'd never believed. I thought that you might sell, a couple of thousand copies like my previous books for the general readership, and it didn't. So there was something there. And now, let me say a little bit about the analysis, okay? 2001. Where were we then, and where are we now? And how far have we, as it were, continued to accelerate? And what does that sort of tell us about the contemporary world? So this is going to be much more of a cultural diagnosis, you might say, than the previous lecture, okay? And it's a kind of diagnosis with which you must feel free to disagree, okay? About the effects of accelerated time. In 2001, we somehow celebrated, or we didn't celebrate because it went unnoticed, the 10th anniversary of a new era. I would say that the new era, okay, after the post-war period, started in 1991. Of course, in this part of the world, you have a particular approach to that period. But also in other parts of the world and globally, we see the development, the embryonic development of what we now think of as global information society. Of course, lots of things started earlier. The internet had existed in an embryonic form since the late 1960s. But it was only in 1991 that Mr. and Mrs. Smith could walk into a shop and buy themselves a subscription to America Online, which they could then use for file exchange and for a bit of email. Of course, they couldn't surf the web yet because the web hadn't been invented in 1991. But it was a couple of years later. And instantaneously grew very big. So that was one thing, the coming of the internet. The new mobile phones came into the world in a big way in 1991. The GSM mobile phones, the tiny phones that you carry around, and when the phone rings, you have to feel your pockets because you don't know where you've got it. Well, there were mobile phones in the 80s as well, but they had a weight of about a kilo and a half. I mean, even if they were not made in the German Democratic Republic, they were big and bulky, okay? And in order to use those phones, you needed a transmitter which filled half the trunk of your car. So they were not that mobile, and you could carry it in a big backpack, okay, if you were, in the Indonesian rainforest and needed to be in contact. So they were not that mobile. So the new mobile phones came into the world in a big way in 1991. And of course, the end of the East European communist dictatorships. Yeah, it happened a bit earlier, but 1991 was a year in which the Soviet Union finally ceased to exist. So that we knew then that this is the end, okay? 1991 was also the beginning of the end of apartheid in South Africa, right? Nelson Mandela had been released from jail just a few months earlier, late 1990, and everybody knew by then that apartheid was about to go. So there was a spirit of openness and of connectivity, and of increased possibilities for global communication. This world, as it were, had become one place, as a sociologist, Anthony Giddens, chirped cheerfully a couple of years later. The world has become one place. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but there were many converging events that took place around 1991, which to me makes sense, makes it sort of justifies speaking about the new era of, well, some call it global information society, some would talk about global neoliberalism, but that's a different lecture, so I'm not going into that now. But that began in 1991, the post-war era. Okay. And what characterizes this era is, to a great extent, the role of networks and the role of information technology. As the sociologist Manuel Castells pointed out in his big book, 3-volume book, called The Information Age from the late 1990s, which still is a bit of a sort of benchmark study. It's a bit dated. I mean, all the data, of course, are obsolete, but the analysis, I think, is still, it's debatable, but useful, okay? But as he points out, information has now become a key factor in all parts of the economy, in consumption, in production, and in distribution, right? So that so that knowledge and information become the main assets in a country's economy. He's exaggerating a bit. There's still a lot of agriculture in the world, and there's still quite a bit of industry. Okay? But even in industry, information technology comes in. The first fully automated car factory was opened in the late 1990s in Toyota City in Japan, where the Lexus was now built without any human interference. Well, there were a couple of humans probably supervising the robots, okay? But it was assembled totally by robots. And the information era is also a period in human history where even pigs have to be IT compatible. You know, they have to be compatible with the latest operating system, because pigs in many farms have a small microchip in the ear, okay? And when they move over to the feeding machine knows exactly, well, knows. It doesn't know anything, but it registers whether or not that pig has just been fed, and whether or not, you know, it should have anything now, okay? So even pigs have to be compatible with the latest operating system. That's the information era. It's not an era where we no longer produce food or no longer engage in industrial production, but where information technology and various forms of knowledge technologies pervade all aspects of information distribution and consumption. Think of the United States. In the 1950s, the sort of the pride of the American economy was General Motors in Detroit. And they produced commodities which had a weight of roughly 4 tons, okay? American family cars from the late 1950s. Whereas the pride of the American economy in the 1990s was Microsoft, which produced commodities which had a weight of less than 1 gram. So you can see that there's a point here in talking about an information age as not just an era where information is important, because information and knowledge have always been important throughout human existence. That's one of the things that sets us apart, isn't it? That we know things and we think about things, and we always did. Even when we were just peering out from the cave mouth, we were still already thinking, and information and knowledge were important. But information has become important as a key factor in the economy. So that's one part of the sort of the framework for what I'm talking about. But I'd like to focus. Okay, I'm focusing on something else, namely what happens when 2 different time regimes meet, the fast and the slow. As I said, my initial engagement with this started in a very existential way, because I felt that something was going wrong in my own ability to concentrate for a long time continuously. And I then started to make observations and to read up. And discovered that, for example, Neil Postman, the well-known cultural critic, a student of Marston McLuhan in the United States, he had written a book, one of his many pessimistic books, about the state of the world, you know, how everything is degenerating. You know, his most famous book was Entertaining Ourselves to Death. And I can think of worse things to do. I mean, it's bad to entertain yourself to death, but there are worse things. I mean, if you have the choice between a marketplace and a battlefield, you know what you choose, okay? So, but in one of his pessimistic books, he talks about his students' increasing loss of ability to think causally, to think in causal chains. You know, that what we could think of as cumulative thought, okay? Cumulative, or to be a bit more pompous, the thought of cumulative organic growth. You know, that you develop an argument, and it's cumulative, in the sense that in order to understand chapter 4, you have to have read chapter 3 before. And he says that my students increasingly no longer use the word because. Okay, they no longer use the word because. This is an anecdote. It's anecdotal evidence, but it adds up to many other forms of evidence, and I'm going to just mention some of them to you during the course of this lecture. And instead, he says, instead of using the word because, they become really good at quoting impenetrable French philosophers, you know, but in very sophisticated ways. And some of them have even understood those philosophers, at least partly. And they become very good at quoting, you know, Derrida and Deleuze and others, but not at building a robust, cumulative, you know, organic causal argument where A leads to B and therefore B leads to C, and that way you get the proper conclusion at the end. And I must say, as a university teacher myself, well, I could sort of, I could to some extent relate to this. And there were many other forms of acceleration that we've been observing. And let me just mention some from outside information technology, because information technology is an obvious case. But I see here the presence of a new cultural pattern. where acceleration is the order of the day. It's partly driven by technology and partly driven by the needs of global neoliberal capitalism. I mean, there are rewards and there is a cost when you do things fast rather than doing things slowly. Because certain things can be done fast and be done fast well, you know, and certain things should be done fast. That's what they mean by when our political leaders and business leaders talk about efficiency. But when you do other things fast, you somehow lose the point of what you're doing. Think about letter writing. I mean, the first keynote speaker spoke about the letter, you know, the handwritten, as it were, letter, which has now become all but obsolete. I don't know if you people send postcards anymore. Some people must, because they still sell postcards, okay? And I do, you know, to my mum, okay? Because she's not online. And she she likes getting postcards, but you don't send postcards to anybody else. Instead, you send an instantaneous MMS message, and they get it immediately. So, in other words, there's a very obvious sense in which the transmission of information has accelerated. And this has some fairly serious. This can have some fairly serious side effects. But let us not linger with information technology, because time is scarce. I can see that I've already spoken for a few minutes, and I have a few other things on my mind. Okay, but just to give you a couple of examples from other realms, to show that we're here talking about a cultural pattern. Take the production of beer. Compare the slow and the fast production of beer. Now, this is a beer drinking country, right? And you have some really high octane, high quality beers here. But you also have some fairly sort of watery, nondescript and uninteresting beers. Many of them imported from large corporations. And the comparison I'm making in some of my writings is between Budvar in the Czech Republic, okay, which is an old European, well-established brewery, and Budweiser in the United States. And they have a shared origin. I mean, Budweiser was started by some immigrants, okay, from that part of the world. But at Budweiser, you produce beer as fast as you can, so that you produce, I mean, hundreds of thousands of gallons, as it were, of beer every day. Whereas with Budvar, you produce beer in an older way. It has to be produced slowly. And when Budweiser, after the end of the Cold War, they tried to buy up Budvar in order to get copyright to the Budweiser label in Europe, which they didn't have. Among other things, the Czechs refused to sell because they said, look, I mean, if we were to succumb to that kind of production regime, we would no longer be able to produce a kind of beer that we feel we should. So rather smaller quantities, more slowly. And that was a brave act of resistance against the general trend of acceleration. Or take chicken. I don't know about Lithuania, okay? I haven't been there long enough. But back home, we have several kinds of chicken. You have the fast and the slow chicken, the way I think about it. And the fast chicken is allowed to live for about 30 days. And it's being fed, you know, I don't know if it's hormone food, but at least it's been fed sort of growth-promoting food, so that it grows really quickly. And it reaches a weight of about 1.5 kilos, you know, within a month. But in order for the chicken, of course, to reach that weight, you can't allow it to move. Because if you allow it to move, it will then use up some of that energy. So you have to make sure that it doesn't move a lot, and you feed it this growth-promoting food. Now, the more expensive, the slower chicken is allowed to live for up to 3 months, 90 days. And it is often even being fed, you know, maize and stuff that chickens like to eat, you know. And those chickens are much more expensive, and they also have a very different taste. The reason being that, as I say, certain things can only be done slowly, such as producing that particular fat underneath the skin in chickens can only be produced slowly. It can't be made in 30 days. And that means that the 90-day chicken is much more juicy and succulent and tasty than the 30-day chicken, all other things being equal. So time in beer and chicken is important. So it's not just about knowledge, but it certainly is about knowledge as well. Well, what happens with knowledge when there is too much of it to go around? I mean, I was thinking about this when I was listening to you this morning, to the first plenary lecture, that until recently, at least in my part of the world, I think that people, at least, you know, middle-class people, they would own all the books that their family members had ever owned, going back maybe to the great-grandparents. You would keep those books, and we have some of those books at home. I mean, yellowing, they're almost falling apart because they haven't been stored properly, but books from the mid-19th century that my great-great-grandparents would have owned and cherished. first or second editions of, unknown novels, nowadays unknown, but then very popular novels from 1870. And one would sort of ceremoniously keep those books because books were considered a form of wealth. It's now the opposite, right? There has been a flip here. So now books are considered a nuisance. There's too many of them. You don't know where to store them. My colleagues who are retiring are despairing because they say, well, I can move out of my office, but what the fuck am I, sorry about that, what the hell am I going to do with all my books? Well, that's actually exactly what they say because they're exasperated. What the hell am I going to do with all my books? Because my spouse will divorce me if I bring all of them at home and insist on having them on display in the living room. So we give books away. We try to get rid of them. My father, who came from a different period, and he had a working class background, so for him books were scarce. He would come home on every Saturday afternoon, having browsed bookshops and second-hand bookshops in the city with two plastic bags full of books. Well, not every Saturday, but now and then. Okay, and he would put, 9 of them into the shelves and start reading the 10th one. That was his notion of being an enlightened person who tried to follow what was going on in the world. For me, it feels like, and for our generation, it feels like a big victory to walk into a bookshop and remove and return, and leave the bookshop empty-handed. Because it shows that your filters are in place. You can browse the bookshop without being too tempted to buy anything because you can filter them away. So the ability to filter out unwanted information has suddenly also become a very scarce resource. So that's another scarce resource. I'm saying that slowness is a scarce resource. The ability to filter out unwanted information has become a hugely scarce resource, and we're far from being sufficiently good at it because we're not really programmed. Evolution hasn't really given us the techniques or the ability to do that sort of thing. One main contrast here between the two knowledge regimes that are now somehow circling around could be described as the knowledge regime of cumulative organic growth and the knowledge regime of instantaneous time. That which is here and now versus that which grows, as it were, slowly. And where in the past, and I suppose to some extent still in the present, at least in a university, which is increasingly becoming a counterculture, because we insist on slowness, right? We insist on slowness in universities. You tell students to read a book, and they look at you, horrified. A monograph, an anthropological monograph from the 1950s, based on fieldwork in the 1930s in Hylland, Burma, on political systems of Hylland, Burma. Why don't you read this book until next week, and then we can talk, And they look at you horrified, because how on earth are they going to find the time to read a book? And that kind of book, which is not a detective book, a crime thriller. How on earth are they going to find that time? Because they have so many other things to do. Updating the Facebook profile, being in contact with people on Twitter, and working a bit and doing all sorts of other things. Watching World Cup football, etc. So you have that. Linear development on the one hand, linear growth, and on the other hand, stacking. And I alluded to that in my little vignette from Neil Postman. Stacking, that you stack things on top of each other, but there's no sort of intrinsic relationship between them. There's no causal relationship between them. They're just stacked, like Lego blocks, but they don't really lead to any, you might say, a structure of significance. So that's one clear effect of the information technology, is that stacking takes over from linear organic development. And we see this in many realms. I've been speculating, but this is just a footnote. I've been speculating that the high divorce rate is also related to this new time regime. Because, one of the hallmarks of human life, one of the things that distinguishes us from other species is our ability to live within a time frame which encompasses what we could call global maxima. The global maxima entails that you accept that things are getting worse for a while because you know that they're going to get better afterwards. You have that sort of time horizon, So that as a student, for example, you know that you're poor. And I remember, as a student, I was fairly poor, sort of by Norwegian standards, Because you don't have a lot of money and you don't want to work too much. But you were quite happy, and you were eating tomato soup every day, because it was the cheapest thing you could buy, and lots of spaghetti, and that sort of noodles, that sort of stuff. But you were okay because you knew that in 3 or 4 or 5 years you would get your degree and you get an exciting job if you were lucky and if you were good. So you have that expectation. Now with marriages, you have the same notion of global maxima. Things are not going too well in marriages. I mean, very often. I mean, there are arguments and there are disagreements and people feel that they're growing apart. But had they had a longer time horizon, they would have known that by the time they retired, they'd be probably or possibly happier than now. Statistics tells us that by the time people retire, they become happier in their marriage than they are in the 1940s when things are so, in the 40s when things are so stressed and so on. So the lack of ability to live within global maxima, accepting that things have to get worse sometimes in order to get better, a longer time horizon, may be related to this. But this was just a footnote. One effect of the prevalence of fast time, instantaneous time, is that decision-making has become much less. It has become much, in some way, it has become much less useful because it's short-term and it's continuously relating to the here and now. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I write about the tyranny of the moment. And a few years later, to my pleasure, I read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is exactly about this in a way, but he frames it in a different way as a psychologist. Thinking Fast and Slow, huge bestseller a couple of years ago, and deservedly so. A good book by a good psychologist about the two forms of thinking. That thinking where you go directly to the solution immediately, the first solution you see, and that thinking where you know that you have to sometimes take 1 or 2 steps back in order to be able to take 3 steps forward. That is to say, slow thinking. Being able to consider the alternatives and take your time considering the alternative before arriving at a decision. But in the private sector nowadays, where there used to be a distinction between long-term and short-term decisions, or long-term and short-term planning, that distinction has now all but vanished in most sectors. Because, as they say, nobody knows what the world's going to look like in another 5 years. So this is there's a sense in which, as I say, modernity has accelerated. And I'm now even, up to now in this lecture, I've still sort of stuck to many of the themes that I developed back in 2001. And if I were to write that book now, it would have had to be a slightly different book. Not at the level of analysis, but at the level of examples. I mean, Web 2.0, the web of the social media and of communication, had barely been invented back in 2001. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, MySpace, all of this came later, right? Came a few years later. So there's this enormous change in the way in which we use the internet and in the way in which we allow other people to interrupt us and interrupt others continuously during our working day. And there are lots of jokes around about people who sit together around the table in a cafe, but nobody's even looking at each other because they're so busy, communicating with others about where they are and what a wonderful time they're having. And that joke was not yet established in 2001. It came a couple of years later. There's hardly any mention at all about SMS, text messages, because it was something considered to be something that young people, probably mostly girls, were into. Sending each other notes, electronic little notes during class, and they could even do it, without the teacher noticing. And by 2003, 2004, it was quite clear that SMS had become a major way of communicating among adults as well, which disrupts, which interrupts, which makes us live in far shorter time spans than we used to. How people make appointments on very short notice, whereas in the past, if you were to meet someone on a Saturday, you actually had to, sometimes you had to start planning it on Monday, and you could spend the week looking forward to that meeting on Saturday. And there are some, I'm going to move very quickly to the final part of the lecture now. But there are some, you might say, some borderline cases. I mean, cases where you can see that this time compression has somehow flipped into something different. And let me give you just 2 brief examples of that. Time compression. You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about fragmentation, compression, stacking, that sort of thing. And the time-space compression that the geographer David Harvey speaks about. Well, I heard about some young people a few years ago who were planning a New Year's party, okay? And there were about 20 of them. And they had several options, several alternatives, and they were texting each other continuously about where to go and when to meet and that sort of thing. And by the time they started to reach a decision, it was already past midnight, you see. So they'd lost somehow the magical moment of the new year because they hadn't been able to take that decision because of incessant texting and too many alternatives. So that's one example. The other example, again, something I have from a colleague of mine who went into a computer shop on Manhattan 3 or 4 years ago to buy a new computer. And you know what they told him? The staff in the computer shop, they told him that, no, I mean, none of the computers we have here are really up to date. I mean, you should wait for a month or two because that's when the new models come in. So as he says, you know, it seems to me that acceleration and the turnover in the capitalist world of commodities, the speed of the turnover has, excuse me, has reached a point where goods are becoming obsolete the moment they hit the shelves. You know, just as a book can be out of date the moment it leaves the printing press. And then you're talking about acceleration in a serious way. One civilizational implication of acceleration and of stacking and compression is this, that youth is being privileged over maturity. And we see this in certain societies, certain kinds of societies, they worship youth. Okay, and ours is one of them. You're meant to be 19 years old all your life. And if you're 50, like me, and you don't pretend to be 19, there's something wrong with you. You're a cultural pessimist, you know, and you're a bad sport, you know. Why is that? Well, because the 19-year-old, it's fantastic to be 19-year-old, okay, if you are 19, but not when you're 49, okay? The 19-year-old and youth in general, they live in exactly that kind of time that I'm describing, and that I've spoken of slightly pessimistically as a tyranny of the moment. They live in the moment, right? Because they do have a past. When you're 19 or 18, you have a past, but you don't care to think much about it. You're ashamed of it, because then you were a child. You don't want to be reminded of your childhood when you're 19. And you do have a future, but the future is very vague and indefinite, because when you're 19, you have you have not yet discovered your mortality. You know, growing up means understanding that you're going to die, okay? And 19-year-olds haven't done that, but they have a very intense here and now. They don't have much of then there and then, and they don't have much of a future because the future is vague and open, but they have a lot of here and now. They have that intensity. So they're open, flexible, and can easily adjust to new situations. Perfect employees for Google, you know? Whereas the pipe-smoking, thoughtful 50-year-old who's knowledgeable about anything from, you know, Greek mythology to Marxist economic analysis, has sort of a competence which is much harder to sell in this kind of market, where you expect it to be versatile, adjustable, flexible, and to sort of shift and change continuously. I could have spoken about this a lot longer, but I can't, because there isn't any more time. But I'd like to say just one thing at the end about another thing that has happened in the last few years. As I started this lecture by pointing out that, in fact, globalization has continued to accelerate after the turn of the century. And had there been a blackboard here, as you can see, I don't use PowerPoint. I mean, unless I have to, because it's not a matter of principle. It's just a matter of sort of personal capability, and I'm not really very good with PowerPoint. And also because one of my hobbies, you see, consists in collecting unintentional side effects of modernity. And I've collected quite a few, and one of them is that the PowerPoint never works when it should. But had there been a blackboard, I would have drawn up an exponential growth curve, and would have said something about, and I'm now just mentioning it in passing, about all the exponential growth curves that we can draw up, beginning just at the end of the 20th century, beginning around the end of the 1990s until now. The growth in international tourism, which has been spectacular, and now just surpassed 1 billion international tourist arrivals 2 years ago. And we don't talk much about this. The growth in cities, especially in the global south. You have cities like Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania, which was designed for a population of up to 50,000, mostly colonial servants and a few people working for them, and as a hub for trade, and now has, with the same infrastructure, something like 2 million people. But nobody knows, nobody's counted them. But that's an estimate. When you look at sort of the city from Google Maps, and from the satellite photos. So you've got that. All right, since I mentioned Africa, the number of Africans online in 2006. The number of Africans online, if you take away South Africa and North Africa, which have a different history, would be somewhere between 1 and 2%. Between 1 and 2%. The figure they're now talking about is somewhere between 20 and 25%. And it's happened in just 8 years. And the reason is not that Africans all of a sudden have laptops, but it's the fact that they've now got cheap pirate copies of iPhones and similar smartphones produced in China and smuggled in by Nigerians and Ghanaians that they can actually afford. So 20% or 25% Africans online. It's an immense change in just 8 or 9 years. Or we could talk about, all of these obvious things. I mean, the number of people on Facebook, or the number of cars in the world. Did you know that? As an illustration of what I'm talking about, Sao Paulo, which is now figuring on TV now and then because of football games, okay, the largest city in South America. In 2011, they measured in Sao Paulo the longest traffic jam on record, the largest traffic jam on record. And it was altogether 517 kilometers long. As an illustration of these sort of overheating effects, what happens when you stack and you compress things too much? You lose all the gaps, okay? You lose those gaps which we used to have when we went to Vilnius, because nobody could reach us during the day. And we now have to deal with all these sort of people who want you, who want something from you, okay? So 517 kilometers traffic jam. And every day, at least every working day, Sundays apart, another 1,000 cars are being let loose on the streets of Sao Paulo. And another 1,000 cars every day. It's quite amazing. I could have taken other examples as well, but I won't. Just as an illustration that there is something fascinating for researchers which is taking place right now. And this is why research on the social and cultural effects of the information revolution and the accelerated modernity of the 21st century very much has to be likened to rebuilding the ship at sea, because it's taking place around us as I speak. And it recalls, and I'll end here, and it recalls to me something that Zygmunt Bauman said many years ago. And I used that quotation in the lecture last night, but on a very different topic. But it's a nice quotation from the 1990s, which conveys somehow the zeitgeist of the 1990s. It's a positive, he intends it in a positive way. And I'm just wondering whether this quotation from Bauman could also be interpreted as a dystopic, as a culturally pessimistic statement. What he says is as follows, more or less. I mean, I'm quoting from memory, okay? If the modern problem of identity consisted in constructing social identities and making them solid and stable, that is the world of cumulative growth, right? Of development and progress. Then the postmodern problem of identity much consists in avoiding fixation and keeping the options open, right? That's what he says. And that is, in a way, that is a celebratory statement about, I don't know, hybridity and mixing and openness and individuality and all the things that we seem to cherish in the modern world. But I'm just wondering, on the basis of what I've said about acceleration, stacking and compression, whether this also has some kind of dystopian dimension. And I think that maybe, as a result of some of the tendencies that I've only just sort of scrape the surface of, some of those tendencies, that it makes sense to talk about postmodernity now, at this very historical moment, because modernity was associated with growth in energy use and a belief in progress. And maybe postmodernity is associated with a loss of belief in progress, the tyranny of the moment, instantaneous time, and a very deep anxiety around our continued growth in energy use.